Hi, welcome to my presentation on the foundations of increasing political polarization within the United States. This presentation will focus on political division that we've seen in the past and recently, and the causes for that. So I focused on conservatives and liberals. I defined a conservative as someone who seeks out traditional social values and private ownership, and a liberal as someone who holds more socially progressive views. The partisan divide is the terminology used to define the overall division, particularly between the liberal and conservative parties, often representing the polarization of political parties within government itself. This is a problem because it creates a lack of cooperation in government, making legislation harder to pass. Parties act in their own interest rather than for the benefit of the whole. There's a prolongated debate of political issues without the implementation of effective solutions. So in other words, they're arguing and not getting things solved or done. It creates a hostile political environment, and citizens distrust the government, causing radicalization. Some factors showing this are middle ground voters and them abstaining from voting, the trend of landslide elections, presidential approval ratings, the use of the filibuster, government shutdown, and then the increased use in impeachment. So a landslide election is an election in which a candidate receives 70% of the electoral college vote. It lacks consideration of the popular vote, often causing kind of issues on that end. As you can see, the 1984 election, to the right, Reagan won about 80% of the electoral vote and only 59% of the popular vote. So there's kind of a disconnect right there. Some key landslide elections. Ronald Reagan in 1980 won 435 votes over Jimmy Carter. This marked a 16-year series in landslide elections, marking a trend back to a conservative president. In 1984, this was the 7th largest election in U.S. history. Incumbent Ronald Reagan had won every state except for Minnesota and D.C. He won 520 electoral votes compared to Mondale, who had only won 13. In 88, H.W. Bush won 426 electoral votes. In 92, he was defeated by Clinton with 370, and in 96, Clinton won 379. Many see the term landslide election as discrediting to the popular vote. Presidents did not overwhelmingly win the popular vote in these cases. The Electoral College victories made it seem as though both sides were in full support of newly elected presidents, which was not the case. Presidential approval ratings have appeared to be lowering over time as a result of division. The gap between liberals and conservatives has widened, contributing to the lowering of ratings. To the right, we can see kind of a widening gap between the opinions of conservatives and liberals on presidents. The use of the filibuster, which is a tool in American politics where a senator can stretch out votes on congressional bills by conducting a speech, they're seen as largely ineffective. Senators must be passionate, though, about their views in order to conduct one. 6 out of the 10 longest filibusters in U.S. history have occurred within the last 40 years. Government shutdown has been a trend since the 1970s, occurring when there is a disagreement in federal budgeting for the following fiscal year. Reagan had more shutdowns than in prior administrations, typically concerning which programs should receive funding. Prior to Clinton, these shutdowns rarely surpassed a week in length. In the 1970s and early 80s, they were more concerned about funding rather than partisan divisions. This has been an increasing trend in correlation to partisan divide. Trump had the longest shutdown in history, lasting from December 18, 2018 until January 25, 2019. Impeachment. There have been many similarities identified between the Clinton and Trump impeachments due to the ineffectiveness regarding the removal of office. Many view this as a waste of government time and resources. So in other words, there's never been a president removed from office, therefore people think that government could be doing other things instead of this. Both House of Representative majority parties and presidents were of opposing political parties at the time of impeachment. Clinton's House of Representatives that impeached him were Republican, whereas Donald Trump's it was Democratic. This questions the power of the House, since the charges in both impeachments were questionable to many. So for my research, I broke this down into 4 subcategories: biological and psychological, economic, institutional, and sociocultural. So within the biological, it questions whether or not your genetics predispose you to favor one party over the other. It's argued that party affiliation is primal and not based on emotion. It gets into nature and nurture, which whether or not a party affiliation is conditioned or genetic response. They even broke it down into what TV shows people watch, as you can see to the right. University of South Carolina conducted a study that affiliated those who were Democratic as having more brain activity in areas related to broad social connectedness, while conservatives had more brain activity in areas related to a tighter social connectedness. University College in London found conservatives tend to have a larger amygdala and that liberals had more gray area within their anterior cingulate cortex. Political psychology and decision-making, confirmation bias, which is a tendency for an individual to associate information with their own beliefs. We see this with people watching certain news stations that might fit within their own political ideas. Ambiguity bias is an individual's tendency to align themselves with information which is more ambiguous. That way it makes the information more likely to be true to them. This plays into bandwagon bias, which refers to the idea that individuals more consistently rationalize their decisions based off of what the majority thinks, and this is used in order to gain political support. Angering bias is the tendency of individuals to focus only on a part of information which fits into their own beliefs. And status quo bias is a greater chance for an individual to choose something familiar to them over something that they don't know. So they might have voted one way last election, so they already, they might know that candidate or that party, so they're going to vote that way again. It causes, potential conforming to societal pressure. They may vote for a candidate just because it seems like a popular thing to do, or their family's voting for that person. The economic lens. This is relatively short, but economic inequality. The top 20% of Americans accounted for 52% of the wealth. Social programs, which are argued to, be aimed at keeping the poor. Political elites creating, dynasties, which we see with Kennedy, Clinton, and Bush popularly. One was a politician, so maybe their family member decided they wanted to run for a political job because of that. Economic downturn, capitalism, and the rise of big business. This gets into the theories of Karl Marx, stagflation, the crisis in the 1970s, big business taking a stance on politics. We see companies like Nike and McDonald's and, being said to be one way or another, playing into economics. The institutional lens. So this gets into bipartisan government, gerrymandering, and the Electoral College. Bipartisan government gets into the branches of government. We have the president and their political party, and as well as Congress, as far as Senate and House political majorities. Politicians are said to be too comfortable in their positions, as we have, 70 and 80-year-olds still in government. Arguably, they're said to become comfortable and, they feel invincible, like nothing's going to happen to them if they do something wrong. Between 1980 and 2014, the U.S. had only seen 8 years in which Congress was unified. This can make legislation hard to pass, sometimes nearly impossible. However, many argue that bipartisan government might also be a good thing as it checks one party. Gerrymandering. The Supreme Court has fought to provide a definition for this. It has been an ongoing issue for decades. The efficiency gap and the effects of gerrymandering in terms of wasted votes, which could have swayed an election one way or another, primarily noted in presidential elections and the Electoral College. The Electoral College, battles between cities and states. Popular vote and electoral votes can differ. This gets into rural versus urban and kind of the placement of the railroad system, where cities along the railroad system were more likely to be Democratic. And of course, I had to make fun of my lovely home state of Florida because we all know there was issues with the Electoral College there at one point. So the sociocultural lens, which gets into the role of social norms and culture in political polarization. So this gets into media, the internet, social media, social norms, social movements, demographics, and identity politics, cancel culture, the music industry, and social psychology. So the media. The tendency for individuals to watch news stations that align with their viewpoints. So we have Fox, which is deemed as conservative, and CNN, which is deemed as liberal. The presentation of information in order to gain views. So these stations, manipulate stories in order to gain views or, to align with their viewers and their political stance. We saw attacks on family members of politicians. In the most extreme case, we had Barron Trump and Chelsea Clinton. Barron Trump was 11 years old when his dad got in office. Chelsea Clinton was 12. And we kind of see attacks on them kind of being scrutinized by the media. And it was extreme because, they were minors at this point in time. And so the internet and social media, we see the issue of censorship right now and fact-checking. Facebook and Twitter have been, two of the big ones with this. People are now saying, social media companies are biased for doing this, and it has made people feel as though they don't have a voice, causing further divide and issues. Social movements such as BLM, women's rights, and LGBTQ, we often see, kind of the media taking advantage of these, kind of making it out to be something that it's not, kind of trying to increase or incite, divide, which is not what, the purpose of these are. Demographics and identity politics. A person's belief and interests are assumed based on factors such as their sex, race, sexual orientation, disability status, etc. The term derived from the idea that members of a particular group were disadvantaged as a result of being a member of that group. So things like, you have to be a Democrat or Republican based on your gender, your race, your sexual orientation, and so on, which kind of really doesn't have necessarily anything to do with your political stance. And then we have cancel culture, which is a newer phenomenon, promoting the canceling of brands, people, shows, TV, etc. It is argued to infringe on First Amendment rights, targets those who hold unpopular views, and has led to cases of harassment, threats, and stalking. And this has also been kind of an issue that we see as a result of political division. And then the music industry, the increase in the use of vulgar language, questioning as to what is acceptable and what's not, the integration of political standpoints into music, politics, artists taking political standpoints and showcasing them like Taylor Swift and Kanye West, song titles such as F Donald Trump, or, certain politicians kind of shedding them in a negative light, the stereotype of genres. If you listen to a certain genre, you must be of a certain political party. Like if you listen to country, you must be a conservative. If you listen to rap or hip hop, you must be democratic, which again has nothing to do with somebody's affiliation. This has also kind of caused some divide as well. Social psychology, scientific study of how people's thoughts and feelings and intentions and goals are constructed within a social context by actual or imagined interactions with others. We have Tajfel's 1971 social identity theory of in-group and out-group. You might be swayed to vote one way if you deem it as the in-group, or, avoid voting one way if it's deemed as the out-group. Milgram's 1963 shock experiment with authority figures. If you feel, someone of, credible, like in your interpretation that's credible or authoritative is telling you to vote one way, you might vote that way. The Stanford prison experiment, which is conformity to social roles. One group might feel they have more power over another. One group might Sorry, it skipped ahead. Well, one group might think, they're lesser than another, or they have less power, so they might end up rebelling against a group. And in conclusion, the political divide is something where there are endless possible factors as to what contributes to it. Virtually anything could cause political division, essentially. It's important to address political division and its causes in order to stop and minimize further polarization, kind of break away from this idea of who's right and who's wrong, of, the government's lying and stuff like that. That way we don't really have these crises like coronavirus where people are not really sure if they can look to the government for help, and they're deeming the littlest of factors as defining of who's what party. Like if you wear a mask, you're liberal; if you don't, you're conservative. So we kind of need to discuss this issue in order to kind of break away from these things. And that is all I have for my slam presentation. So thank you for listening.